My father stole what was never his to take my maternal grandfather's $8 million legacy. He thought he buried the truth so deep that I would never uncover it. But fate had other plans. One freezing night, he dragged me by the arm and threw me out into the snow like I was nothing. The icy wind cut through my skin, and I knew he wanted me to break. Instead, I stumbled into my grandpa's old shed, desperate to survive. My hands shook as I tore through dusty boxes, searching for warmth, for anything to keep me alive. And that's when I found it, an old hidden box locked away for years. Inside was something far more powerful than a blanket. It was the truth, a truth that could destroy every lie my father built, a truth that proved the fortune he flaunted never belonged to him. From that moment, I knew my life would never be the same. But here's the question you'll want answered. How does a freezing night and a forgotten box turn into the downfall of a man who thought he could control everything? Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you will make you question not only family but betrayal, justice, and what true legacy really means. My name is Michael Rowan Kane. I was 17 years old, still finishing high school and living on the ranch in Arizona that had once belonged to my maternal grandfather. To the world outside, it might have looked like I had the makings of a good life, a big house, a father who ran the family name with pride, and a mother who kept the home warm. But what people could not see was the shadow that fell over every corner of that house. A shadow cast by my father, Damon Kane. It was an evening in the dead of winter when everything broke open. Snow had begun to fall early that day, rare but brutal in the high desert. The wind screamed across the empty land, rattling windows, cutting through every crack in the walls. Inside, the fire had burned low and tension was thick as smoke. Damon sat in his leather chair, whiskey glass in hand, boasting again about what he had earned. He spoke of money as though it had sprouted from his own sweat, his own blood. I had heard it all before, but that night the words burned deeper. "You think this roof stands because of you?" He sneered, swirling the glass. "Every inch of this place is mine. Mine to spend, mine to command." The words slipped out of me before I could stop them, a truth I had swallowed too many times. Grandpa left it for me. The room froze colder than the snow outside. My mother, Leora, gasped softly, her hands trembling as she set down a plate on the counter. Damon's eyes cut into me sharp and cruel, as though I had committed the gravest sin. His face flushed red, not from the whiskey but from fury. "What did you say?" His voice dropped low like thunder before the strike. I repeated it, though my knees threatened to buckle. "Grandpa left it for me, not for you." In that instant, I saw the mask peel from his face. The charming smile he wore for neighbors, the polished tone he used in town meetings, gone. What stood before me was raw, vicious rage. He slammed his glass down, shards of crystal flying across the floor. "You ungrateful brat!" His hand gripped my arm like iron. My mother rushed forward, her voice breaking. "Damon, please, he's just a boy!" But Damon shoved her aside as if her pleas were nothing but air. He dragged me down the hall, my feet slipping on the wood. Each step toward the back door felt like a march to the gallows. My breath caught, not from fear of the cold, but from fear of him. He flung open the door and the night roared in. Snow whipped across the porch, the kind that stung your skin like knives. Before I could beg, before I could reason, he hurled me out into the storm. I landed hard, my palms scraping ice, my chest burning as the air was ripped from my lungs. "Learn some respect," he barked, his silhouette framed by the warm light inside. Then the door slammed shut, the lock clicking into place. I pounded on the door, fists raw, voice hoarse. "Dad, please, I'm freezing." But only silence answered, broken by the wind's howl. My mother's muffled sobs seeped through the door, but Damon's voice drowned them out. "He needs to learn." The snow seeped into my clothes, numbing my fingers and toes. Each breath was fire and ice together, searing my chest. I stumbled to my feet, dizzy, knowing if I stayed there I would not last the night. My eyes scanned the dark horizon, and then I saw it, the outline of my grandfather's old shed at the edge of the property. That place had always unnerved me. Abandoned tools, sagging beams, shadows that seemed to whisper. Yet in that moment it was the only hope I had. My legs barely carried me, each step sinking into drifts that clutched at my ankles. I forced myself forward, one thought pounding in my head: survive. When I reached the shed, my hands shook so badly I could hardly grasp the handle. I pushed the wood, groaning hinges screaming against the cold. The door creaked open and the darkness inside swallowed me whole. The air smelled of damp wood and dust, the scent of years long gone. I staggered in my body, trembling, my teeth chattering so loud I thought the sound would split the night. I leaned against the wall, breath coming in ragged clouds. The shadows pressed close, and for a moment I wondered if I had traded one kind of death for another. But something inside me sparked defiance, maybe, or the voice of my grandfather echoing in my memory. That night Damon threw me into the snow, but he also threw me into the truth. And though I didn't yet know it, the shed I feared would soon reveal the secret that could shatter every lie he had built. The air inside the shed clung heavy and damp, colder than the storm I had just escaped. My breath came in ragged bursts, steam curling upward into the rafters. I stumbled deeper into the shadows, arms wrapped around my chest, searching for anything that might hold heat. My fingers brushed against warped wood, rusted tools, broken crates. Then tucked into the far corner beneath a tangle of rope and burlap, I saw it. An old wooden trunk I remembered from childhood. My grandfather had guarded it fiercely, never letting me touch it. Some things are meant to stay shut, he used to say. Yet now, half frozen and desperate, that trunk seemed less like a warning and more like a lifeline. I dragged it into the dim light, spilling through a crack in the wall. Dust rose in clouds, choking the air as I pried at the heavy lid with numb hands. The hinges groaned in protest, but finally gave way. Inside, I expected old quilts or coats, anything to fight the cold. Instead, yellowed papers and brittle photographs spilled out. For a moment, disappointment crushed me. Paper wouldn't save me from freezing to death. But then my eyes caught on an envelope, thick-sealed and marked with my name in handwriting I knew as well as my own heartbeat, my grandfather's bold, steady script. My hands shook as I lifted it. Even in the weak light, I could see the ink strokes, the firmness of his letters. My chest tightened. He had written this for me. The storm outside howled against the walls, but all I heard was the silence of that shed and the pounding of my heart. I tore it open, half afraid of what I might find. The first line blurred as tears welled, but I forced myself to focus. Michael, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. And Damon has done what I feared he might. The words cut deeper than the cold ever could. He had known. My grandfather had seen through the charm, the false smile my father showed the world. He had known the greed, the hunger that lived in Damon Kane. My throat tightened as I read on. Rowan had sold the land for $5 million and invested wisely, building it into $8 million, set aside in a trust, my trust. The money, the legacy, everything was meant for me when I turned 18. Damon was never the heir, only the guardian until I came of age. My knees weakened and I sank onto the dirt floor, the letter trembling in my hands. It was proof that my father had lied, stolen, and paraded around with wealth that was never his. Proof that my grandfather had seen me not as a boy to be ignored, but as the true keeper of his legacy. I thought of all the times Damon had thrown his words at me like stones. You'd be nothing without me. And here in black and white was the truth: he was nothing without what belonged to me. My eyes burned hot even as my body shook with cold. For the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of power. I whispered into the darkness, my voice trembling but fierce. Grandpa didn't leave me alone. The words echoed back from the rafters, stronger each time, as if the shed itself carried his spirit. I pressed the will to my chest, clinging to it like armor. Every insult, every bruise, every night of silence in that house, they all cracked under the weight of this revelation. I was not worthless. I was not invisible. I was Rowan Miller's grandson, chosen and trusted. But with that knowledge came fear. If Damon discovered this, he would stop at nothing to destroy it. I knew him well enough, his rage, his obsession with control. He would burn the paper before letting me keep it. My breath quickened as the realization settled in. This was no gift I could celebrate openly. It was a weapon, one I had to hide until the day I was legally free. Months felt like an eternity, yet they were all that stood between me and the life my grandfather intended. The storm outside rattled the shed, snow drifting through cracks in the walls. I pulled old coats from the trunk and wrapped myself in them, trying to steady the trembling in my bones. Each rustle of fabric, each gust of wind sounded like footsteps, like Damon's voice booming through the night. I buried the envelope beneath the layers of cloth, as if tucking it into a grave no one could disturb. My mind raced with plans I wasn't yet ready to speak even to myself. The truth was mine now, but so was the burden of keeping it safe. As I lay there on the dirt floor, the will pressed close to my heart. I knew the battle had only begun. Damon thought he had broken me when he cast me into the snow. He had no idea he had thrown me straight into the one place that could unravel him completely. And then, faint through the storm, I thought I heard the crunch of boots on snow outside the shed. My breath caught. Had he followed me? The moment I pressed the envelope against my chest, the shed seemed to dissolve into a blur of shadows and memories. The wind rattled the walls, but in my mind, I was no longer a shivering boy on a freezing night. I was back in the summer sun, standing beside my grandfather, Rowan Miller, in the wide Arizona fields. He wore the same sweat-stained hat he always had, his hands rough from years of work, but his eyes were steady and kind. He had a way of making the land feel alive, of turning every acre into a lesson about strength and honor. I remembered trailing behind him as a child, my sneakers caked with dust, watching him repair a fence post with the patience of a craftsman. "Don't ever think the land is just dirt," he told me, resting his hand on the wood as though it had a heartbeat. Then he looked at me, his gaze both stern and gentle. "The land is more than soil. It holds every drop of sweat you pour into it." At the time, I only half understood, but now, holding his will in my frozen hands, those words thundered inside me with new meaning. Rowan believed in labor and dignity and keeping your word. He built the ranch from nothing, raising cattle under a sun that showed no mercy, saving dollar by dollar until he could buy each stretch of land. The townsfolk respected him not only for his wealth, but for the way he carried himself. He never cheated a man, never took more than his share. He could be hard, yes, but never cruel. Around me, he softened. I was not just his grandson, I was the one he trusted to listen, to carry on what he had built. And how different that was from Damon. My father measured worth only in what he could spend, what he could flaunt before others. While Rowan poured his sweat into the land, Damon poured his into whiskey and deals that lined only his pockets. Where my grandfather saw honor, my father saw leverage. Where Rowan taught me endurance, Damon taught me fear. That contrast cut me to the bone. It was as if I lived in two worlds, the warm embrace of a man who valued me for who I was, and the cold scorn of another who saw me only as an obstacle to his greed. I thought back to nights when Rowan would let me sit on the porch beside him. He smoked his pipe, the smell of tobacco mixing with the desert air, and he told me stories about men who lost everything chasing shortcuts. Michael, he'd say, tapping the ashes away, money is loud, but honor speaks longer. He must have known then what kind of man Damon truly was. Perhaps that was why he wrote my name on that envelope, why he left his legacy to me, not to his son-in-law. In his eyes, I wasn't just a boy. I was the future of his bloodline, even if that blood came through my mother. The weight of it both lifted me and pinned me down. I felt pride swelling in my chest. Rowan had chosen me. Yet alongside it was a bitter anger. Damon strutted around the ranch, barking orders, spending money, humiliating my mother and me, all while pretending he was the rightful heir. He had fooled everyone, and I had let him. I thought of the nights I had cried silently, thinking I was unwanted, when all along the truth lay hidden in that trunk. I clenched the will tighter, fury sharpening my breath. My father had stolen not only money but years of my life, crushing me with lies. But no more. Each word in Rowan's letter was a weapon in my hands, every sentence a shield against Damon's cruelty. The injustice burned hotter than the cold burned my skin. I could almost see Damon's face when I would one day place this paper before him, stripping away his power in front of the world. That vision carried me through the shivering, through the fear that clawed at me. Still, I knew danger waited. Damon's greed was endless, his temper boundless. If he even suspected this truth, he would tear the ranch apart to bury it again. My pulse raced at the thought of him storming into the shed, finding me with the letter clutched in my hands. I wasn't ready, not yet. I had months before I turned 18, months to hide, to plan, to endure. Rowan had trusted me with more than money. He had trusted me to be strong enough to wait. I closed my eyes and saw Rowan's weathered hands guiding mine across the reins of a horse, steadying me when I was afraid. His voice echoed across the years, a whisper threading through the roar of the storm outside. He had prepared me for this moment in ways I hadn't recognized then. Now I understood. The land, the legacy, the values, he had placed them all in me. My lips parted and I repeated the words that had once been only a lesson but now felt like a vow. The land is more than soil. It holds every drop of sweat you pour into it. Speaking them out loud steadied me, gave me strength. This ranch wasn't Damon's trophy, it was Rowan's blood, and it would one day be mine. I pulled the coats tighter around me, eyes fixed on the fragile paper glowing faintly in the lantern light. For the first time I felt something Damon could never take from me. Hope. Yet even as warmth spread in my chest, a chill ran down my spine. From outside the shed came the distant slam of a door carried on the wind. My father was still awake, and if he came looking, I wasn't sure I could keep the secret hidden much longer. When I left the shed the next morning, clutching the secret close to my chest, the house looked the same as it always had. The red clay bricks, the sagging porch, the smoke curling from the chimney, nothing had changed on the outside. But inside, everything felt different. My father still believed he ruled the ranch like a king, but I now carried proof that his crown was stolen. That truth made the air heavier, every glance sharper, every silence more dangerous. Damon Kane controlled not just the money but the rhythm of our lives. And he wielded that control with cruelty that seeped into every room. Every dollar that came through the house passed through his hands first. He decided what my mother and I ate, what clothes we wore, even whether the lights stayed on in my room. He spent thousands on whiskey, on suits, on nights out with men who cheered his swagger, yet he counted every crumb left on our plates. My mother folded the grocery money like it was holy scripture, knowing if she asked for more, he would lash out with words sharper than knives. Sometimes those words turned to blows, his shadow stretched long over us, and we walked carefully beneath it, never daring to step out of line. But in those small cracks of tyranny, my mother found ways to protect me. When Damon wasn't looking, she slipped me an extra piece of bread, tucking it into a napkin so he wouldn't notice. She whispered late at night when the house grew quiet, telling me I was stronger than he knew, that I carried my grandfather's fire in my veins. Those whispers were like lanterns in a mind, tiny lights, keeping me from being swallowed whole. She bore the bruises of silence so that I might still breathe. Every time I looked into her tired eyes, I saw love and defeat living side by side. School should have been my escape, but even there my father's grip followed me. He rarely let me stay after class or join friends on weekends. When classmates asked why I always disappeared, I forced a smile and lied. Over time, the invitations stopped. I became the boy who walked alone, the one too quiet, too guarded. Teachers noticed the weariness in my face, but when they asked, I said everything was fine. The truth stayed locked behind my teeth, just like the will was hidden in the shed. Isolation became its own prison, one built not of walls but of fear and shame. Yet the injustice that pressed down on me also began to harden something inside. Each insult from Damon, each slammed door, each night I listened to my mother cry quietly in her room. They carved lines into me, not of weakness but of resolve. I began to see Damon not as a father but as a thief wearing a mask. He thought he owned us because he controlled the money, but deep down I knew the truth. He was living on borrowed power that would crumble the moment the will saw daylight. One night, after another dinner where Damon ridiculed me for eating his food, I sat in the dark with my mother. She touched my shoulder, her fingers thin and trembling, and whispered, "You'll survive this, Michael. You'll find a way." The words caught in my throat, but I forced them out, my voice low but steady. "One day I'll break free." It was the first time I said it aloud, the first time I let the dream of escape and justice slip into the air between us. Her eyes widened, then softened, and I knew she believed me. That belief was enough to keep me going. But Damon was not blind. He sensed changes he could not name, a defiance flickering in my eyes. His suspicion grew sharper, his temper shorter. He began prowling the house at night, opening doors, checking drawers, as though he expected to catch me hiding something. Each step of his boots across the floorboards made my stomach twist. The secret in the shed felt heavier every day, and I realized it was only a matter of time before he searched there too. One evening, as the wind whipped across the desert and the house creaked against the cold, I heard him mutter to himself after slamming a cabinet door, "Rowan left something. I'll find it. And when I do, he'll have nothing." My blood ran cold. He didn't know the truth yet, but he was hunting for it. The storm inside the house was building, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it broke wide open. The night after I whispered my vow to my mother, I could not sleep. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like Damon's boots. Every gust of wind through the window felt like his breath on my neck. I knew then that hiding the will in the trunk was not enough. Damon prowled too close, his suspicion sharpening each day. If he stormed into the shed and threw everything open, the envelope would be the first thing he saw. I had to do something more, something permanent. So under the dim light of a lantern, I pried at the rotting planks of the shed floor until one came loose with a groan. My fingers ached, but I worked until a small hollow opened beneath the boards. I wrapped the envelope in cloth, layered it with scraps of burlap, and slid it into the darkness. Covering it again, I pressed the plank back in place and whispered, "You're safe now, Grandpa. I'll protect it no matter what." For days after, I carried the secret like a stone in my chest. The shed became my sanctuary and my prison all at once. I checked the floor daily, tracing the seams of the wood to make sure it hadn't shifted, terrified that Damon would notice. And Damon was circling closer. He had begun muttering about Rowan in his drunken rages, his voice cutting through the walls like a saw. "The old man never trusted me," he spat one night. But he had to leave something. He couldn't take it to the grave. His words made my blood freeze. He was searching in his mind, clawing for proof, and sooner or later he would bring that hunt to the shed. The moment came sooner than I expected. I watched from the kitchen window as Damon staggered across the yard one evening, the cold air whipping his coat around him. He pushed the shed door open so hard it slammed against the wall, then his silhouette filled the frame. My stomach dropped. I wanted to run, to shout, to beg him to stop, but I couldn't move. I saw him inside, kicking over boxes, hurling tools against the walls. Dust swirled around him like smoke as he tore through my grandfather's things, muttering curses that grew louder with every crash. Then his voice cut through the night like a blade. "I know Rowan left something," he roared, his fist smashing against the side of the trunk. The sound made me flinch even from across the yard. My breath caught in my throat, my heart pounding so violently I feared he might hear it. He ripped through old coats, shoved aside piles of rope, but his rage was blind, unfocused. He was close, too close, but he did not see beneath the floor. From my vantage point, I could almost feel the boards vibrating beneath his boots, protecting the secret with their silence. When he finally stormed back out, slamming the door behind him, my knees buckled with relief. But that relief was laced with terror. If Damon was willing to rip the shed apart, it was only a matter of time before he tore up the floor too. I couldn't shake the vision of him yanking the board loose, holding the envelope in his hands and crushing every hope I had left. That night I sat awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the will pressing down on me harder than ever. Worse still, I noticed his eyes shifting more often toward my mother. When she passed him in the hall, he lingered too long, as if gauging her secrets. Once at dinner, he stopped mid-bite and looked at her with a narrow, suspicious glare. "You always did know more than you let on," he sneered. She didn't answer, only lowered her gaze to her plate, but my pulse quickened. He was widening his circle of doubt, and sooner or later the storm would land on her. I clenched my fists beneath the table, the vow rising again in my chest. I had to protect both my mother and my grandfather's legacy, even if it meant Damon would turn all his wrath on me. The game of silence could not last forever. One way or another, the truth would surface, and I had to be ready when it did. The pressure had been building ever since Damon stormed into the shed, convinced Rowan had left something behind. I knew I could not carry the secret alone any longer. One night, after Damon's footsteps faded down the hall and his door slammed shut, I crept to the shed, pulled up the floorboard, and cradled the envelope once more. The paper felt heavier now, not just with my grandfather's words, but with the weight of survival. My mother deserved to know. She had borne Damon's cruelty in silence for years. She deserved the truth that could break his hold on us. I found her in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she dried a cracked dish. The lamplight caught the hollows in her face, the toll of too many nights spent in fear. I placed the envelope on the table between us, sliding it forward like an offering. Her brow furrowed until her eyes caught the handwriting across the front. I saw the recognition strike her before she even touched it. She lifted the papers with care, unfolding them as if they were holy scripture. Her lips moved as she read, her hands beginning to shake harder with every line. Then the tears came, quiet at first, then spilling freely. She pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to stifle the sob that rose in her throat. Finally, she whispered, her voice breaking, "Rowan never trusted your father." The words hung in the air like a confession, a truth long suspected but never spoken. She looked at me, her eyes wet with both sorrow and relief. He saw through him all along. He knew. I nodded, my chest tight, because I too had always known deep down. The will was proof that Damon's empire of control was nothing but theft draped in lies. For the first time in years, my mother reached across the table and gripped my hand with a strength that surprised me. "We'll protect this," she said. "We'll protect you." The bond in that moment felt unbreakable. Yet the walls of the house seemed to listen, and betrayal was only a breath away. Because before I could answer, the sound of heavy boots echoed down the hallway. The kitchen door slammed open, and there stood Damon, his face red with drink and suspicion, his eyes locked on the envelope clutched in my mother's hands. For a moment he froze, as though the sight alone had confirmed his worst fear. Then his face twisted, rage breaking through like a storm. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice low but quaking with fury. He lunged forward, snatching the will from her grasp with such force the papers nearly tore. My mother cried out, "Damon, no!" But he ignored her, his eyes racing across the words, his lips curling into a snarl as he read. "You think this means anything?" he spat, waving the papers in the air. "You think a few scribbles on a page will change what I've built? This ranch, this house, every damn thing, you'd have nothing without me." He crumpled the will in his fist, but I stepped forward, my body trembling with a courage I didn't know I had. "It's not yours," I shouted, my voice cracking but steady. "Grandpa left it for me. You've been stealing from me all these years." The room seemed to quake with the weight of the words. Damon's face darkened, his eyes burning with the fury of a man whose power was slipping through his fingers. He raised his fist, but before he could strike, I lunged at him. I clawed at his hand, desperate, fueled by years of humiliation and pain. "You can't take this from me," I screamed, my fingers gripping the envelope with all the strength I had left. For a heartbeat, it felt as though the whole house was holding its breath. My mother's voice rose behind me, trembling but firm. "He's right, Damon. Rowan never trusted you. He trusted Michael." Damon's grip faltered just enough for me to yank the papers free, clutching them against my chest like armor. The shock in his eyes was fleeting, quickly swallowed by rage, but for the first time I saw something else there too. Fear. He stepped back, his jaw clenched, his fists shaking. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by my ragged breathing. My mother moved to my side, her hand resting on my shoulder, her body trembling but her stance unyielding. Damon's power was no longer absolute. He had seen the will, had heard the words he feared most spoken aloud. The truth was no longer buried, yet the battle was far from over. Damon's lips curled into a cold smile, one that made my blood run cold. "You think you've won something," he muttered. "This house, this town, they believe me, not you. And I'll make sure they never see you as anything but a boy with foolish dreams." He turned and stormed down the hall, the sound of his boots like thunder fading into the distance. I held the papers tighter, knowing this was only the beginning. My father would not give up easily, and now he would strike harder than ever. The question that loomed over me as the night pressed in was whether I was strong enough to strike back before he destroyed everything Rowan had left in my hands. Damon's footsteps still echoed in my mind long after he stormed down the hall that night. But something inside me had shifted. For the first time I had stood between him and his lies and hadn't flinched. My mother stood beside me too, her trembling hand on my shoulder, no longer the touch of a woman beaten down by fear, but of one beginning to reclaim her strength. The will had done more than prove Damon a thief. It had awakened us both to the truth that his power was built on sand. In the days that followed, I felt myself walking taller. Damon still barked orders, still tried to loom over me with his fists and his sneers, but his words no longer cut as deep. Each insult slid against the shield of Rowan's handwriting, the knowledge that I was the rightful heir to everything Damon paraded as his own. My mother changed too. She no longer rushed to quiet me when I spoke. She looked Damon in the eye more often, her silence no longer submission but defiance. Damon noticed. He grew restless, his temper fraying like a rope about to snap. He poured more whiskey into his glass each night, his voice slurring as he cursed the air. I watched him throw money at bar tabs, gambling debts, and empty business schemes as though spending faster could keep the truth from catching him. The suits that once gleamed on his shoulders looked shabby, stained with drink and sweat. His arrogance was beginning to look more like desperation. The neighbors started to whisper. At first, it was only in passing, a tilted head when Damon swaggered into church late, the quiet exchange of glances when his car rolled up, too loud, too flashy for a rancher who hadn't worked the fields in years. Then the murmurs grew louder. "Cane's living too high," I overheard one man say at the feed store. "Doesn't smell right." Their respect was slipping away just as Rowan had predicted it would if Damon ever lost the mask. It was in that atmosphere of decay that my mother finally found her voice. One evening, Damon stumbled in, slamming the front door so hard the windows rattled. He dropped a half-empty bottle on the table and glared at us both as if daring us to speak. My mother stood straighter than I had ever seen her, her face pale but her eyes blazing. Her voice cut through the silence with a clarity that startled even me. "You've stolen enough, Damon." The words froze the room. Damon's jaw fell open, the whiskey bottle tipping slightly in his hand. For a moment he looked less like the tyrant who had ruled our house, and more like a man stripped bare. But then his face twisted, rage bubbling up to cover the crack. He lunged across the room, shouting curses, but my mother did not back away this time. She stood her ground, and I stepped forward to stand beside her. For the first time, Damon faced both of us, united against him. He snarled and shoved a chair aside, his voice rising to a roar. "You think you can turn this town against me? You think they'll believe you over me?" His words rang hollow, more desperate than powerful, and yet beneath his fury I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the dawning realization that his grip was loosening, that the walls were beginning to close in. Later that night I lay awake, listening to the sound of his pacing down the hall, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He muttered to himself, fragments of paranoia spilling into the air. "They're watching. They're talking." It was clear he knew the whispers had begun, and that knowledge gnawed at him more than anything. I pressed the will against my chest, knowing the time was coming when silence would no longer be enough. The neighbors' suspicions were growing. My mother had finally broken her silence, and Damon was unraveling before our eyes. The question now was not whether the truth would come out, but how violently Damon would fight to stop it. The whispers in town were growing louder, and Damon felt them like barbs under his skin. He strutted through the streets with his shoulders squared, but his swagger had cracks now, his smile a little too wide, his laughter a little too sharp. One evening he returned home with a thick folder tucked beneath his arm, the stench of whiskey still clinging to him. I saw the gleam in his eyes, the kind of gleam that always meant trouble. Days later, he summoned us to the dining room with papers spread across the table. "Here," he said, smugly tapping the stack with one finger, "the proof you've been waiting for. Rowan left it all to me. Signed, sealed, legal." His voice carried triumph, but I caught the flicker of fear behind it. My mother reached for the papers with trembling hands, scanning the lines, her lips pressed tight. At first glance, it looked convincing, typed documents stamped with notary marks, and at the bottom my grandfather's name scrawled in bold ink. Damon leaned back in his chair, pouring himself another drink. "You see, you've wasted your time clinging to scraps. This house, this land, it's mine. Always has been." His voice carried a venom meant to crush us. But something gnawed at me. I remembered Rowan's handwriting from the birthday cards he used to slip into my pockets, from the small notes he left tucked under tools in the shed. His letters had weight, a rhythm shaped by years of steady labor. The signature on Damon's paper looked wrong, too smooth, too rushed, as if the hand behind it had never known a callus. I didn't say anything then, but the doubt burned inside me like a fuse waiting to reach the powder. That night, when the house was quiet and Damon had passed out in his chair with a bottle dangling from his hand, I crept back into the kitchen. I took the forged document from the table, heart pounding, and carried it to the shed. With a lantern in one hand and the real will in the other, I laid the two side by side on the workbench. My breath fogged in the cold air as I bent close, comparing every curve, every stroke. Rowan's real signature was firm, deliberate, with a slight lean to the right that spoke of discipline and consistency. The one Damon presented sagged like a lie, letters uneven, the pressure of the pen too weak. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as the truth sank in. My father hadn't just stolen money. He hadn't just lied. He had dared to forge even my grandfather's hand, trying to rewrite history itself. I whispered into the darkness, my voice breaking but resolute. He forged even my grandfather's hand. The words felt like a vow, like a spark that could ignite the fire Rowan had left in me. In that moment, I knew what had to come next. Damon's web of lies could not survive the light of truth. The false will was his last defense, and if I could prove it false, the whole house of cards would tumble down around him. I tucked both documents back into their hiding places, my hands trembling but my mind clear. I thought of the neighbors whispering of the respect Damon was losing, of the way my mother's voice had finally risen against him. The tide was turning, but Damon was too blinded by his own pride to see it. He thought he had us cornered, but he had already left the crack that would undo him. When I returned to the house, Damon stirred in his chair, his bloodshot eyes catching me in the doorway. "Looking for something, boy?" He slurred, his smile twisting. I shook my head, keeping the secret pressed against my chest like armor. His laugh was hollow, a drunkard's attempt at menace. He didn't know that his greatest weapon was already broken. I climbed into bed, but sleep did not come. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the echo of my grandfather's voice telling me to stand tall. The forged will was proof not just of Damon's greed, but of his desperation. He knew the truth was slipping from his grip, and this was his last attempt to chain us to his lies. But desperation makes men reckless, and as I closed my eyes, I knew Damon would not stop here. He would fight harder, lash out stronger, and drag us into the public eye if he had to. The forged papers were not the end of his deceit. They were the beginning of a battle that could only end in court, where the world would finally see the truth. The courthouse in town had never felt so heavy. Its brick walls loomed like sentinels, the flag outside snapping in the wind as if reminding everyone who passed through its doors that truth and justice still mattered. On that morning, the benches inside were filled not just with lawyers and clerks, but with neighbors who had once respected my father. They had come to witness what many whispered about, but few dared to say aloud: that Damon Kane had built his life on deceit. I sat at the front with my mother by my side, her hand gripping mine, her knuckles white. Across the aisle, Damon strutted in a polished suit on his shoulders and a smirk plastered on his face. In his hands, he carried the binder of forged documents as though they were the very keys to his kingdom. When the judge called the session to order, Damon was quick to resist. His lawyer, a slick man with a silver tie, presented the papers with confidence. "Your Honor," the lawyer declared, "these documents clearly establish Mr. Kane as the rightful heir to Mr. Rowan Miller's estate. They are signed, notarized, and binding." The words rolled off his tongue with rehearsed ease. Damon leaned back in his chair, arms folded, his eyes darting around the room as if daring anyone to challenge him. For a moment I felt the weight of his bravado pressing against me, the same intimidation he had used my entire life. My hands trembled, but then I remembered Rowan's steady voice, and I stood. My grandfather never trusted him. I said, my voice cracking but clear. The courtroom stilled. My mother squeezed my hand once more. Then I reached into my coat and pulled out the envelope I had guarded through frost and fear. My steps toward the bench felt like crossing a battlefield, each one heavier than the last, but I laid the papers down with reverence. This is the original will, handwritten and signed by Rowan Miller himself. My father was only the guardian, never the heir. My words carried the weight of every bruise, every silence, every night Damon had tried to bury me under his lies. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he examined the two sets of documents. A court-appointed expert was called to compare them, and the room grew tense with silence. Neighbors shifted in their seats, whispering just loud enough for Damon to hear. The expert placed the signatures side by side under a magnifying glass, tracing the strokes with a practiced eye. This one, he said, pointing to Damon's version, shows inconsistency. The pen pressure is uneven, the formation unnatural. It does not match Mr. Miller's authentic hand. His conclusion landed like a hammer. Damon's smirk faltered, the color draining from his face as the words echoed through the chamber. Gasps rippled through the room. My mother bowed her head, tears of relief sliding down her cheeks. I felt my own chest swell with a mix of triumph and vindication, but I kept my eyes on Damon. His jaw clenched, his fists balled, his carefully constructed facade crumbling before everyone who had once admired him. The judge looked directly at him, stern and unyielding. "Forgery is a grave matter, Mr. Kane. You will answer for this." Damon's face flushed, deep red sweat beading along his hairline. For the first time, the man who had ruled our lives with iron fists looked small, cornered, and desperate. I glanced back at the benches where the neighbors sat. Some shook their heads, others whispered prayers, but all of them now knew what I had carried for so long, that my father was no heir, only a thief. The truth that had been hidden in the shadows of the shed now shone under the courtroom lights, undeniable and damning. I tightened my grip on the will, feeling Rowan's presence steadying me. His legacy no longer buried but alive in my hands. Yet as the gavel struck, signaling the end of that session, Damon's eyes locked on mine. They were not the eyes of a man defeated, but of one cornered, a man who would rather burn the house down than surrender it. His lips curled into a snarl that only I could see, and in that moment I knew the battle was not over. The law had exposed his lie, but his fury was only beginning to rise. The judgment came down like thunder. The gavel struck once firm and final, and the judge's voice cut through the crowded courtroom. Damon Kane no longer had any legal claim over Rowan Miller's estate. The land, the funds, the legacy, all of it was stripped from his grasp. For a man who had built his life pretending to stand taller than everyone else, the words reduced him to dust. His face flushed a dark crimson, his jaw clenched, but no amount of bravado could cover the humiliation that poured over him in front of the town he once commanded with charm and lies. When we stepped outside into the sharp sunlight, it was as though the world itself had shifted. The same men who had once slapped Damon on the back now avoided his eyes. Partners who had drunk with him laughed at his boasts and followed his lead turned their shoulders cold. They whispered to one another, but not to him. Some spat on the ground as he passed. To them, he was no longer a man of influence, but a fraud exposed. I heard one neighbor, old Mr. Harris, shake his head as he leaned on his cane and muttered, "Rowan was right about him." The words carried like a verdict, even harsher than the one inside the courthouse. Damon tried to carry himself as if he didn't hear, but his stride faltered. His suit, once pressed and gleaming, looked too tight, wrinkled, stained at the collar. The mask he had worn for years was crumbling, and behind it was not a powerful rancher or a respected heir, but a desperate man stripped bare. That night he returned home to silence. No more phone calls from investors, no more visits from men hoping to profit off his arrogance. His whiskey glass sat heavy in his hand. But even that could not dull the reality pressing down on him. I watched him from the shadows, the man who had thrown me into the snow, who had stolen my childhood, now drowning in the weight of his own lies. My mother sat across the table from him, her chin raised, her fear replaced by something like dignity. For the first time, she did not flinch when he spoke. She looked at him not as a husband, but as a man she no longer had to fear. The ranch itself seemed to echo his downfall. The workers no longer came by. The barns grew quiet, the cattle grazed unattended. Damon shouted orders to the wind, but there was no one left to obey. At the feed store, the clerk rang up his purchases with icy politeness, no longer eager to please. At church, people shifted away from his pew, their prayers no longer mingling with his presence. His world, once propped up by stolen wealth and deceit, was collapsing piece by piece. But even as his empire rotted, the danger did not disappear. Damon's eyes grew darker, his silences longer, his temper sharper. At night I could hear him pacing the floorboards, creaking like groans under the weight of his rage. He had lost everything. He clung to power, respect, control, but men like Damon do not go quietly. My mother and I knew that beneath the ruin a storm was still building. One evening as I stood by the window, the horizon painted red by the setting sun, I saw Damon outside by the barn, his shoulders slumped, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He looked less like a conqueror and more like a ghost of himself. For a fleeting moment I almost felt pity, but then he turned his eyes, catching the window where I stood. There was no surrender in them, only a simmering fire, a promise of one last desperate fight. The storm inside him was not finished, and as the night drew in, I realized that while the court had freed us on paper, the real battle for our freedom was still waiting to be fought within the walls of our own home. The silence after Damon's downfall felt different. It was not the silence of fear that had once filled our home, but the silence of possibility. The ranch stood before me, battered by years of neglect, its fences leaning, its barns sagging under weather and time. Yet as I looked across the land under the Arizona sun, I did not see ruin. I saw the bones of something worth saving, the echo of my grandfather's voice urging me to rebuild. With the inheritance finally in my hands, I set out to breathe life The money was not just numbers on the account. It was sweat turned into dollars, land turned into legacy. I hired men who respected Rowan's name, men who had worked beside him in the old days. Together we mended fences, cleared fields, and restored the barns. Each nail driven and each board replaced felt like stitching back together the honor Damon had tried to shred. My mother and I began with the shed, the same shed that had sheltered me on that freezing night. We swept away years of dust, lifted broken boxes, and cleared away rusted tool. In the corner sat my grandfather's old workbench, scarred with hammer marks, its surface darkened by oil and time. I placed my hands on it and felt a rush of memory, the nights he had taught me to drive a nail straight, the mornings he reminded me that every task, no matter how small, carried weight. We kept that bench along with his tools not as relics, but as reminders. One afternoon, while the sunlight streamed through the cracks in the shed, my mother and I found ourselves surrounded by Rowan's things. His worn gloves, his wide-brimmed hat, the ledger he had used to track cattle. She held the hat in her hands, her eyes brimming with tears, and whispered, "He never truly left us." I nodded, my chest tightening. That moment was not about money or victory. It was about reclaiming what Damon had tried to erase. As the ranch took shape, neighbors began to visit. Some came curious, others came offering help. Where once people had come to Damon's gatherings out of obligation, now they came freely, smiling, shaking my hand, offering stories about Rowan. Old men told me how he had lent them tools when their farms struggled. Women recalled how he had delivered food quietly to families in need. With every story, I felt the weight of responsibility grow heavier, but it was a burden I welcomed. The land itself seemed to respond. Fields that had lain barren began to stir with green. Cattle returned to the pastures, and the sound of life replaced the hollow quiet Damon had left behind. One evening, standing with my mother at the edge of the property, I spoke aloud the vow that had burned inside me since that night in the snow. This ranch will carry his name, not Damon's lies. The words hung in the air, sharp and clear, carried off by the desert wind as if Rowan himself was listening. But even in the triumph of rebuilding, shadows lingered. Damon was not gone. Though stripped of wealth and respect, he still haunted the edges of town, his eyes filled with bitterness. I heard whispers of him drinking alone, muttering about what was taken from him, vowing revenge and slurred promises. Each rumor reminded me that our freedom, though hard-won, was not yet complete. One night, as I locked the barn after a long day's work, I caught sight of a figure at the far fence line. The outline was familiar, the stance rigid. My stomach tightened as the man turned and walked into the darkness. It was Damon. He no longer had power, but he had not let go, and I knew deep in my bones that before true peace could come, one final reckoning still waited. The ranch thrived again, carrying Rowan's name with dignity, but beyond its fences, Damon's shadow still lingered. He had not vanished into the night like I once feared he might. Instead, he remained in town, stripped of wealth, stripped of power, stripped even of the swagger that had once fooled so many. Now he walked alone, his clothes worn thin, his shoulders bent under the weight of disgrace. The man who once dined with investors and boasted of fortunes now sat hunched at the corner cafe, nursing a single cup of coffee as though it were the last tie to his former life. I saw him sometimes when I went into town. Our eyes would meet across the street or through a dusty window pane. For years I had lived in terror of those eyes, waiting for the rage behind them to break me. But now, when they met mine, I felt nothing but a cold detachment. There was no victory in gloating, no satisfaction in taunting. Justice had already been served. He lived each day as the echo of his own downfall, and that was punishment enough. So I would look away, step past him, and carry on with the life he once tried to steal from me. My mother, ever wise in her quiet way, spoke words that stayed with me. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the Arizona sky fade into dusk, she said, "Sometimes revenge is just letting truth live on." Her voice was steady, her gaze far off, as though she could still see Rowan walking the land. She had endured Damon's cruelty longer than anyone yet. She was the first to understand that our freedom was not measured by his suffering, but by our peace. Her words softened the last hard edge of anger that still clung to me. Yet Damon's presence was not without its sting. Neighbors who had once whispered about him now passed him without acknowledgement. Old partners refused his handshake. At church, his pew sat empty. The world that had once fueled his pride now closed its doors against him, leaving him to wander the margins. People said he talked to himself at night, sitting outside his small rented room, muttering about how it was all stolen from him. But I knew the truth: he had stolen from himself long before he ever tried to steal from me. One autumn afternoon, as I repaired the last fence along the far field, I found myself thinking about the journey from that freezing night to this moment. I remembered the snow biting at my skin, the shed swallowing me in darkness, and the letter that lit a fire inside me. Without Damon's cruelty, I might never have opened that box, never discovered the truth my grandfather left behind. Life had a cruel way of shaping destiny. But sometimes even cruelty carried you to the place you were meant to stand. The ranch became not just a home, but a living memorial. Rowan's tools hung neatly in the shed, his hat rested by the door, his name carved into the gate at the front. When neighbors came to visit, they no longer whispered about scandal or betrayal. They spoke instead of Rowan's honor, of his legacy, and of how the land had returned to life. In their voices I heard not only respect for him, but acceptance for me. I had taken what Damon sought to bury and made it grow again. Still, when I thought of Damon, I felt a strange kind of pity. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but pity. He had gambled everything on lies and lost. He had chosen greed over family, control over love, pride over truth. And in the end, he stood alone with nothing. His downfall was not a story of money lost, but of a man undone by the weight of his own deceit. One night, as the stars stretched across the desert sky, I whispered words meant only for Rowan. Money doesn't destroy people. Lies do. The truth of it rang deeper than anything I had ever known. Damon had built his life on lies, and they had consumed him. I chose the truth, and it had set me free. The story did not end with wealth reclaimed or titles restored. It ended with something greater: peace. My mother and I carried forward the values Rowan had instilled: hard work, honor, resilience. Damon's shadow would always be part of our story, but only as the darkness that made the light more visible. As I looked across the fields, I wondered if others hearing this tale would see their own truths reflected. What would they choose, lies that chain or truths that set free? And that is how my story comes to an end. My father tried to bury me under lies, but in the end it was the truth that buried him. I carry my grandfather's legacy not just in land or money, but in the values he planted deep within me. Honor, endurance, and the courage to stand tall against injustice. If you've walked this journey with me, I ask you to carry one thing forward. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not striking back, but living in a way that proves the liar wrong. I would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever seen how lies tear a family apart, or how truth, though painful, sets someone free? Share your story in the comments. And if this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that justice can come even when it seems impossible. After all, money doesn't destroy people. Lies do.